Gracious Heavenly Father, I thank you for your mercies and I ask you to help us to understand who you are, how you've made us, and how you would have us love and live with one another in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
So basically, Rousseau created the world that you live in, so that's something you should know. He had a profound impact on the way we think about the human person, certainly the way we think about the political world and its structures. Famously, at the beginning of his The Social Contract, which is worth listening to and certainly worth reading or at least being familiar with, he says, "Man is born free, and everywhere he is in change. One thinks himself the master of others and still remains a greater slave than they. How did this change come about? I do not know." And here's what explains our political context. What can make it legitimate? That question, I think, I can answer. And then the following pages are really a brilliant, at times beautiful, but also sometimes exasperating exploration of what it means to create a social political world based on the autonomous individual's personal freedom. What he would call their natural state. For Rousseau and others, our natural state is one of independent, complete and total freedom, but we can't really live that way functionally after there's more than one of us. So we have to enter into social contracts, and then he elaborates some really profoundly helpful things, and also just at my concern is at its foundation, he has an insufficient view of the human person. And, we won't spend time unpacking that, but he wrote that, and a few years later, we read this in our Declaration of Independence. All of our founding fathers, certainly, well, all of them, Jefferson, of course, among them, was familiar with all these writers, certainly familiar with Rousseau, and knew deeply what his thoughts were. And he says something that is true and untrue. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. And my argument is that they're only kind of self-evident. In fact, they hadn't been self-evident in human history until the advent of Christianity in the West, when it changed our vision of the human person. The idea that a slave, and of course we can hear the inherent contradictions of the evolution of society in a statement like that still had slaves, but the idea in the Roman world that a slave and a senator had equal value would have been, not only, they would have never considered that. If you would have argued that, they would have thought you were ridiculous. So when they say in our Declaration of Independence that it's self-evident, what they really mean is, let me put it this way. After 1,500 years of Christianity in the West, and then 200 years of exploration and the Enlightenment, we now think it's pretty obvious that all men are created equal, which is a very, very different thing. And that's what you see in this next slide, and then we're going to talk through briefly a brief part of a longer PowerPoint deck before we look today at the human person. It's our first effort, our first desire or goal, and then I'm going to take a brief peek at liberalism and conservatism, and then we're going to look at different models of political engagement. So let's take a look at some of these passages. Genesis 1:28, let's create man in our image. That's a foundational cornerstone of biblical anthropology, and it's also, over the course of the history of the West, it became the cornerstone for our vision of society in general and of our legal system. It's fascinating to trace how the incarnation profoundly impacted our vision of humanity. The atonement, the idea that you embrace a relationship with God as an individual, unmediated, had these profound impacts. You can read there's thousands of pages written on this by non-Christians, by the way, who just acknowledge it and can trace it through history. But I want us to read the two things that really changed the world. One, the expansion of the understanding of the image of God. And who can read Romans 1, 1 through 4 for us. I was thinking you'd do that out loud. That would be even better.
Paul, a servant of Christ Jesus, called to be an apostle, set apart for the gospel of God, which he promised beforehand through his prophets in the Holy Scriptures concerning his Son, who was descended from David according to the flesh, and was declared to be the Son of God in power according to the Spirit of holiness by his resurrection from the dead, Jesus Christ our Lord.
There's so much in that passage, but I want us to put it in relationship to Genesis chapter 1 that identifies the image-bearing constitution of the human person. And then, to accent that foundation, the Son of God in the story of redemption becomes one of us. And it is a screaming, shouting, cosmic affirmation of the significance and the importance of humanity. And then if you go to these next couple passages, which I'll just let you look up later, you're familiar probably with Matthew 10, 34 through 37, because it's pretty awkward. It's basically, Jesus said, don't think I came to bring the sword, or bring peace, I came to bring a sword, and father will be against son, and mother will be against daughter, and he goes on to challenge the primacy, or maybe better, the ultimacy of the human family. That was at the very root, that challenged the way the whole world worked and the way people saw themselves, and still the way people see themselves today in many parts of the world. And then Galatians, that famous passage, neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free. You need to see these things as tectonic shifts in the way the human sees themselves and sees others. And they had a significant impact on the development of the West. Let me read this for you. The foundation, this is by a guy named Larry Seidentop. He is, I think, a Harvard emeritus professor. He's got a book called Inventing the Individual, which basically just explains how the West created the way we see human beings, and that it's unique in history, and that it's impossible to conceive of. In fact, is a direct relationship to the doctrines and influence of Christianity in the West. The foundations of modern Europe lay in the long, difficult process of converting a moral claim to a social status. What he means by that is converting the moral claim that we have people are image-bearing and have value and significance independent of their social status. That's the moral claim. It took over 1,000 years through really canon law that then crept its way into civil law in Europe to turn that into a social status that was protected by rights. It was a pursuit of belief in the equality of souls that made the conversion possible. A commitment to individual liberty sprang from that. Combining the two values gave rise to the principle which more than any other has defined modern liberal thinking, the principle of equal liberty. Now, the reason that that's important is because, as others have pointed out, and I could point to Tom Holland, for example, others, you may have heard of Tom Holland's book. What is significant about that is that what we need to understand is the foundation of the root of criticisms of Christianity in the West in our age would not exist without Christianity. And so the image that I used a few weeks back of the clipped flowers, the flowers are still beautiful. The value of the individual is still vibrant, but it's been cut off from its roots. And that's what I want us to see for a few minutes. I want us to see how this changed. And really, the reason these next few minutes are important is because I want us to understand when we think of governing, this is the kind of person, including us, we're thinking about governing. So 2,000 years ago, this was you. You would have defined yourself by your city and your tribe, by your household, by your ancestors, by your social status, and by your ethnicity. Those things would have had, I would say, near absolute control over your sense of self. But I think it's even more fundamental than that. I think it would be exceptional to find a person 2,000 years ago that sat in a room and thought, gee, I wonder who I am in my essence. Like, that's a question that rich people in the West ask. And you would have not asked that question. You would have said, well, this is my tribe, this is my family, this is the city I live in, I work. There's all kinds of, you could just dig into social history in the ancient world. I'm a slave, that means that's just what I am, that's my station. And, by the way, believe me, I'm not idealizing that. I'm not saying, let's go back to that. But what happened from that is, over the next 2,000 years, or really probably 1,500 or 1,000, the image bearer in the Christian West, starts to expand beyond those, beyond and overtake those defining barriers that surrounded the person. Because what we find is that when Christianity became, one of the reasons it became so attractive and influential is that you could look at somebody who was a slave and say you have an immediate value, and you can immediately participate in in fellowship with God and his people, independent of your status. And then, as I said, I don't have time to go into it, but over the ensuing centuries, that central value started to get kneaded into first the canon law, that is the church law, and then the civic law. For example, you can read in a number of places, I won't cite them, but you can read canon law established about who gets to decide who gets married or who you marry. And it started to, over centuries, dissolve down to the individual. And then it's always been a tension between the two. But what I want us to see is that the darker emphasis and the larger circle, once we need that idea of, and we could have put the incarnation in there too. It's really, honestly, it's a triumvirate. It's the image of God, the incarnation, and the resurrection. Those three things together change the way we see. And this is what's so exasperating, is that in world history, the value of the individual human person that we're trying to think about governing, and we take so seriously and is so foundational and we should cherish, wouldn't even happen if it weren't for, let me use a bad word. Can I use a bad word? Christendom. It just would not have happened. So, but let me tell you what we're left with now. This is you this morning. You this morning have been divorced from your ethnicity, your nation, even your physical constitution, your economics. You're just going to fly all these things together, and you're just going to go through a process that self-defines. It's the other end of the spectrum. You're going to start with the universe, not God. The universe is disenchanted now, but by that I mean it's completely seen as secular. It doesn't have, there's not a spiritual layer over it, except maybe paganism, which is integrated with it. When I say secular time, what I mean by that is there's no rhythmic understanding of redemption before, middle, and after. It's just seen as perpetuation of one time-space moment after another that's not really connected to a larger story. And then you, then you start to have a number of experiences, and those experiences start to inform the way you see and feel about yourself. You learn some technique, either often through psychology or some other methodology socially, where you start to define yourself, and then you just decide who you are. And once you decide who you are, you find an affinity group to hang with. And that's what we all do. That's what our children do. It's what we do. It's what I do if we're not careful and thoughtful. And then there you are. Then you tell us who you are. And then the group that you are with affirms who you are. And then here we are. And so that's why it's so difficult to govern. Now, I don't want to idealize that, okay? because there are profound social and personal problems with that. But I also want us to be realistic about this. Sartre and the other existentialists were devastated. They were devastated that we had to figure out who we are. That sucked for them. Because they weren't, honestly, just to be frank, they weren't affluent 18-year-old freshmen studying existentialism on their parents' nickel, living in a world that pretty much gave them what they want. And that's when existentialism becomes super sexy. We're like, but this is awesome. Well, we're starting to see people, I think we're, this is my little phrase, it's probably, will go nowhere, but we're actually, I think, in late stage secularism. It's just, the whole structure is breaking down. We can't talk to each other. We've revisited tribalism. Nobody wants to be governed. It's what you get without some anchoring center. So we're going to talk some more about that. But first, I want to talk about liberalism and conservatism. I want to point to David Koisis, who's, I'll let you read that article, but what I want to talk about, and what we have been talking about, is first of all, classical liberalism versus political liberalism today. We've just discussed the origins of what I want to call, and others too, classic liberalism. Classic liberalism is just what we've been speaking, a valuation of the individual's integrity and autonomy and equal value with everyone. That is, and therefore the effort to maximize or at least protect their personal freedom. It's basically the transition from subjects to citizens. You're not a subject anymore because you have, by some social contract, remember we talked about Rousseau, you get to sign on at some level to who's going to govern you. That's why we had a revolution. Our founding fathers like, hey, we're not getting to sign on enough. When you think about what they were really upset about, sometimes, I don't know, we need to look at that carefully as non-Americans and say, maybe you got swept up in the vortex of your own momentum, because it wasn't quite, all of it wasn't quite as oppressive as some of our documents say. Would you cut that out of this video, please? But what I want us to see is liberalism and conservatism are both founded on classic liberalism. Classic liberalism is not the political liberalism that we're familiar with today. It's this foundational principle that I was just speaking of. And so I struggle with how to go about doing this, but what political liberalism has done is taken the primacy of the individual and turned it in, maximalized that into the principle for human government. And so what that does, and I'll just try to do it, and I wanted to do more diagrams, but I'm just totally, by the way, channeling Koisis now. So if you disagree with this, take it up with the guy that I'm totally ripping off for the whole part of this section. But what it does is liberalism starts with
political liberalism.
Thank you. Political liberalism starts with this idea of the free individual. Rousseau talked about us in our natural state. Basically, our natural state is pretty chill. But the problem is, it's also vulnerable. So we make a commonwealth. So we get together and make a contract. Okay. The commonwealth then eventually grows. This is a pattern that Koisis brings up. And it talks about the watchman state. It creates a watchman state. And the watchman state is there to I'm going to get them right, to make sure that liberty is not overly infringed upon. The watchman state becomes the regulatory state. Which means that not only do they watch, but they preemptively order culture so that you won't be infringed upon. And then what you can see this happening in 20th century American politics. Then it's what he calls choice enhancement. That once it's regulatory, then they start to leverage that idea and use government to not only to protect or to enhance, but to deliver values, political, educational, economic values that that the society finds worthwhile. What happens after choice enhancement, however, when it's intensively individualized, is social conflict, according to Coises. Because what's happened is, what's happened in this cycle is that the entire apparatus of the Commonwealth has been applied to the flourishing, abstractly and independently understood as the individual. And this is why liberalism, like conservatism left by itself, turns into a form either of soft or hard totalitarianism. Because it has to deliver freedom. It creates social conflict. The more it tries to enforce equality and other things, the more it fractures the world. Now this sounds like, man, Pastor Kelly, right on. He's really down on liberalism. We're in a great church. I lost my eraser. Oh, there it is. It's not really an eraser. But the problem that Coises mentions, and I don't have time. His book examines the idolatry and ideology of democracy, capitalism, socialism, liberalism, conservatism, and he goes through all of them. And basically, what he's trying to teach us, and it's very valuable, is that the first thing a Christian should do when they think about their own political ideology is think about it in terms of idolatry. What is the salvation story for liberalism? And what is the salvation story for conservatism? The problem with liberalism is Christianity endorses authority. And get this, it also endorses conformity. So the liberalism story, the individual freedom story, it has an essential component in a Christian worldview, but it can't be absolutized. So I don't have a fancy diagram like that for conservatism, but I want to ask you if you can actually really even define what conservatism is, because there's a lot of people smarter than us who are having trouble even understanding what that means. Because at the root of it is to conserve. Get it? You had to get here you had to get Sunday school for that. Is to conserve or preserve something established. In the case of politics, it's a political order, an economic order, and our social order. But let me ask you this then. Under that definition, was George Washington a conservative or a liberal? Well, he couldn't have been a very good conservative because his whole point was to destroy and establish social and political order. So although if we started to identify particular social, political, ethical visions of conservatism, we might be able to do that. But the problem with identifying ourselves that way is that the salvation story for conservatism is actually pretty much the same as for liberalism politically, which is to exalt and protect the individual at all costs. So we don't do a circle. This is what I would call it. When I say we, I don't know if you may be liberal, but I'm basically conservative. I'm sure you picked that up by now, but not in an absolutist way. I'm more theologically and ethically conservative, and then we need to think about how that can be used and misused and abused and everything else. But, there's a lot of stuff in the Bible that should make you concerned about, and me concerned about, what have become classic political liberal concerns, like racism and economic justice and all that. That's why these labels are unhelpful for us. Because what conservatives do is we don't do a circle, we just build a wall. We have certain values about about consistency of customs and institutions and keeping them established. You know, G.K. Chesterton famously said the difference between a liberal and a conservative is that a liberal sees a wall, part of a wall in the middle of the woods, and he just breaks it down, and the conservative says, well, why was it put up in the first place? And so that's kind of our temperament. You know, the wall probably shouldn't be there, but and we need to live in those tensions. It's interesting because my political vision, personally, when I'm just thinking as an individual citizen of Seattle without a collar on, is I wouldn't say it's middle road. I don't like the language of middle road. I just want it to be correct, you know, and I want it to be biblically reflective of the values of God. But the problem with conservatism is that who wants to keep things the way they are? Who wants to keep things the way they are? This is not a trick question. It's the people who like things the way they are. Okay? And so in that respect, was Jesus a conservative? No, he was not a conservative. He was a rebel. And that is the problem, especially in our circle. It is not a secret that affluent people tend to be conservative. Why is that? I mean, we'll see if that changes in the next 20 or 30 years. But it is because we get what we want. It's working for us. But when conservatives get upset that people are rioting and destroying places, well, you know, we should. That's, by the way, we're on the record. I'm on the record speaking for the church. That's bad when you riot and destroy places. But you know what? Here's an established fact in human history. If a group of people in a broader culture feel excluded by political and social barriers from participating in the prosperity of the larger group, they riot. That happened, you know who did that? My people, the Irish people did it 100 years ago. We tore stuff up, we burnt stuff down because we couldn't get in. That's just the way it is. It's always been that way. Spartacus did that with the slaves. Pardon me. So the problem with conservatism is that basically we have this sense of the golden age, right? And we always want to get back to the golden age. And liberalism is we have a utopian sense. And we always want to realize a utopia. And we want to get back to Eden, or we want to get ahead to the new heavens and the new earth. And that's why it would be very valuable for us to lose, you know, I use that moniker for me because if you just went, like if I took a survey, I would end up conservative. But I don't like the language, I don't like the label, because my job isn't just to preserve and protect. My job should also be as a citizen to advance and disrupt and to change social orders that keep people hungry and uncared for and remove their opportunities for justice or some sort of civic flourishing. So one of the goals that I had for our discussion is to help us deconstruct those two words. So I'm asking you to ask yourselves, I got ahead of myself a little bit for that. Don't pay attention to that yet, you'll just get confused. Is to ask ourselves, what salvation story is being told? I don't know why that's up there. What salvation story is being told by your political ideology? And if you don't have an answer to that, and by the way, in this sense, it won't be a biblical answer. Like the answer to that will be your social momentum, your temperament, your inclinations for what you want. There will be biblical intersections with it. But ask yourselves whether you're liberal or conservative, and we surely have both in this church, beyond a doubt. Ask yourself, really, if I'm not very intentional about this, what's my salvation story? What am I asking of this? And you should have some answers that make you uncomfortable. You absolutely should have some answers that make you uncomfortable. Because that's what we do. Our ideologies become idolatries, and there we have it. So before I go on for the last part and talk about these 4 models of integration, by the way, the tension in conservatism is that Christianity challenges authority and conformity. So I'm trying to point out that Jesus won't let the political liberal or the political conservative be comfortable. And if you think that Jesus is only conservative or politically or only liberal politically, just read the Bible again. Because you can't find out. That's why every party loves quoting Jesus. People just be loving to quote Jesus. We love quoting Jesus. Let's start submitting to Jesus. And giving ourselves a fuller view of human society and politics. Anybody have any questions about that before we talk about some of this stuff on the board here?
I mean, none of the political ideologies really reflect. So when I think about this, I think like, okay, the very liberal view is that the government, well, the state will save us. If we can just get the things right, the state and the state's enforcement can save us. And then the libertarian / somewhat conservative view is that they maximize the individual's protections and freedoms, right?
Yeah,
and then that sense of freedom, our exercise of our own freedom will save us, right?
Yeah.
And then as Christians, we know Jesus is the one who saves us,
That's what I'm
saying. But so how does now we're talking about being stewards and citizens.
Sure.
How does our
Remember the diagram I put up early? We're going to have 3 things that intersect the Venn diagram. One is we have to order our allegiances.
Yes.
So that's the Jesus part of it. Then we have to advocate for justice, which becomes more complicated, and then we have to live with ambiguity. So honestly, John, my answer to your question is live with ambiguity.
Yeah.
Because for example, the new capital gains tax that was passed last year in state of Washington was upheld by the state Supreme Court. Here's just a little glimpse into my political head. I've been opposed to what are called sometimes death taxes for forever and ever, and I would be opposed to taxing before political gain is realized. But the more I read the Bible, the more I read history, the more I understood that there are elements of Scripture that recognize that amassing unqualified generational wealth in one family or one group of families after another indefinitely is probably not good for the whole political ecosystem and people. So, that sort of shifted. That's an example of that sort of shifted I still have some questions about that, but what I do find, for example, we talked about Old Testament law and trying to apply the general equity thereof. The Old Testament law did periodically over time reestablish economic social status.
Jubilee?
What's that?
The Jubilee?
The Jubilee, where we can think of that. It also preserved, there's just a lot of stuff. Let's just stick with the Jubilee because that's one example of it. But what I'm saying is, for example, now you might hear me say that, and you might say, well, I thought Pastor Kelly just told me he was a conservative. He sounds like a total liberal right now because he wants to redistribute wealth. Well, maybe that's true. Maybe my father's dreams, my family's dreams, I'm the only conservative in my family. Maybe their dreams are slowly coming true. I don't think so. But we have to live and experience that kind of tension. I don't get to simply look at things from one perspective, and I need to be able to challenge. Now, I have other questions about what the government's going to do with all that money. That's a different question. But as a fact, I've learned to have some category for it. All right, so all right, let's take a look because we need to take a look now at 4 methods, 4 approaches, 4 models for engaging Christian engagement in the political world. The first, I'm going to name them, and then I'm going to put them on that axis that you see there on the screen. The first one is Anabaptist. Anabaptist literally means to baptize again. It was part of the more radical Reformation in the 16th century, where they had a very flat view of the church and very separatist view of engagement with the culture. And so there would be an example of them today would be, for example, would be the Mennonites, who really divorced themselves as much as possible from the political reality and would, for example, think the Anabaptist tradition would be pacifist and believe that it's that a Christian should never take another person's life under any circumstances, and or incarcerate anyone or do any of those muscular coercive actions that a government does. That they have different views about whether or not that's just a manifestation of the old demonic world. Some of them, some of their leading thinkers do that, or for other reasons they would just separate themselves. There's another group. So we got the Anabaptists, and then we've got the Two Kingdoms group. Two Kingdoms. We're not Anabaptist in our tradition, okay? But there are a number of people in our tradition that are, I'm just going to call them two kingdoms. I don't want to write it out. That's two kingdoms. And they mean there's basically an earthly kingdom, and what's the other one? See, you guys are good. And that Augustine talked about the city of God and the city of the world, or the city of earth. And that these two kingdoms live together and they must interact with one another at some level. So, for example, a two kingdoms person, would probably not have a scruple of being, well, they wouldn't generally have a scruple against being involved in the apparatus of government as a legislator or a president or a president warden or anything else, right? They would but they would understand that they live in sort of two different realms. They go back and forth living completely through two different kinds of realms. Now, then we've got...
Can I give you an example of what I think that means?
Sure.
So let's say you'd say, well, my marriage is before God, but there's a civil marriage that's before the government of the church. Or, I'm sorry, the government of the state.
Yeah, they might take a position like that. So what?
And so there's just those two things, and I can separate those in my own brain about which one's which.
That's probably a good example.
My friends who aren't Christians don't
Yeah, who cares?
need to.
Yeah, it's not a thing.
religious version.
So then there's the hot button of the day. Then there's Christian nationalism. And Christian nationalism is actually harder to define. I don't know if it's harder to define, but Christian nationalism wants to bring the two together and use Christian influence to enforce a Christian ethical and worldview, and it blends the two. It blends the state and the church together pretty substantially. And I'll let you read more about that. You know, in your own setting, what we're doing is we, meaning this congregation and its leaders, we're not Anabaptist. I don't know any leaders in this congregation who have a two kingdoms approach. We're not Christian nationalism. We're something called neo-Calvinism. And neo-Calvinism says the church is called to create a leavening social order in the state. So let's go through those. I should have looked at those first statements. In Anabaptist, the church is called to be a distinct social civic order separated from the state. Two kingdoms, the church is called to be a parallel social order within the state. Christian nationalism, the church is called to be a unified social order with the state. And neo-Calvinism, the church is called to be a leavening social order in the state. And so what I want us to see is this diagram here that has been up for a while. There are basically, these four fit into various quadrants that move along two two axes. One is they have an opposing reality to the world order. Either one by separating or two by overtaking, okay? Or they, over on this side, they have a shared reality. They understand the distinctions, but they're just gonna live distinct from it, but they understand they're still in that world and they can move back and forth, or they're gonna try to have a leavening influence on it. And so these two groups on this axis, above this line, they're separative, right? They want to live distinct, either in more categorical terms or in more parallel terms. And then down here, they're transformative. They want to have an influence. We could say either more mechanically or more organically. And so we need to understand what we mean. Realms are just the spiritual, social, political home of the church and state. Spheres, we're going to talk about those in a minute, the area of mission for the state and the church. Realities are just a larger context. How do you see the whole world and how you fit together? Separative, we just want to be distinct. Transformative, we're going to have influence. We're going to have influence on that. Now, I'm going to elaborate on Neo-Calvinism's origin and values here in a minute, but before we go into that, I want to understand if you have questions about one of the four models, and also about the distinction between opposing and shared and separative and transformative. Yes?
So, the word neo, I just looked it up, couldn't get a good definition. When you say neo-conservative, you're usually referring to somebody who's kind of conservative, but they're not all the way there.
Okay.
So when you say neo-Calvinism,
Yeah.
does that mean?
Tell you what, I'm going to go deep into that very thing and the very next thing, so we'll
okay.
circle back to that. We're going to talk about what that means and what it doesn't mean. But I want to understand the quadrants. Above are separative, but they might oppose, or they might understand they share the world's reality. Below are transformative. They might want to do it organically, or we could just say more mechanically, governmentally.
I don't really understand the shared reality of the neo-Calvinist and the two kingdoms view.
Okay. That's a good question. What I'm trying to indicate here is that both two kingdoms and neo-Calvinism realize that we live in a common order that we don't have, we can't totally remove ourselves from, and we don't have total control over, and never will, and probably in this age shouldn't. So on the other side of it, the opposing realities, by the way, everyone here is living in the same reality. It's just about how they view it. Christian nationalism, it wants to transform, but these realities are opposing, and Christian nationalism would be, well, it's opposing and we're going to change that. We're going to absorb it. So it's not opposing. And the Anabaptists would be, well, it is opposing and we're just going to stay away from it because it's just not going to be our world. Now, these, by the way, these things are so complicated, and there's one, we could have made a big Venn diagram about all these, and this language is inherently, I could spend the next class qualifying all the things I mean here. But what I'm trying to explain is that we live in the same world, acknowledge it, we do it in different ways here, and we're going to share that with the world because we just have to, and we're going to either separate from it or completely transform it and take it over. It's pretty abstract stuff, so thanks for bearing with me.
Can I do a different example with all of these?
Sure.
So let's just do smoking pot, right?
Okay.
If I'm an Anabaptist.
By the way, you mean we're going to talk about smoking pot?
Right, yeah.
I think it's my job as a minister to define the conversation.
So an Anabaptist is like, we're going to go live in our own community and enforce our own laws about no smoking pot, even though we live in a state that has smoking pot.
Yeah.
And our own government is going to, make sure that we don't do that, right? If I move over into two kingdoms, it's like, hey, I live in Seattle, the state says it's okay, but we don't do it in our household, but we understand that.
Yeah.
If I'm a Christian nationalist, I'm saying I'm going to go enforce. I'm going to go move to a different state and enforce
Whatever that is.
non-smoking pot
Yeah.
with the police power onto
Okay.
others who want to.
Yeah.
And then if I'm a neo-Calvinist, I am in Seattle, living in a world where it's legal, and I am not doing it myself, and I'm going and being friends with my neighbor who's doing it and saying,
Yeah.
be in a relationship with this person.
Yeah,
and
as
saying,
long-
is
as
this
long
good?
as-
Is this serving you?
Yeah,
Like,
it's just serving you, yeah.
Yeah.
And then, but also, Neo-Calvinism might not be opposed to having governmental influence over that, too.
Sure, I still may vote for somebody
Yeah,
who says, I
for
don't think this
example,
is
yeah,
good."
exactly. But also, for example, just for our friends that imbibe that, let's make sure we talk about alcohol too. We already do that with alcohol regulated heavily, maybe we'd say not heavily enough. But yeah, that's a good example. So let me get to this next page because I want to, only got a couple more minutes, but Todd has a question.
I don't know about a question, just more of an observation of how I could see what, and maybe I'm gonna say what I'm thinking in my head, totally wrong, but at a certain point, there's gotta be some not straight dividing lines
Yeah.
between all those,
Oh,
but
yeah.
some
Absolutely.
meshing back and forth.
That's
and-
exactly.
because if you're in the bottom right, essentially you're saying you give all those who believe exactly the opposite of you the control and the power to enforce their will and whims upon you.
Yeah, well, I'm glad you picked that up because, yeah, like I said, I'm trying to simplify in order to instruct the emphases of each one of these. But I would say, as a neo-Calvinist myself, falling in that approach, I would say I accept that people do things and I don't, and their political decisions, like abortion in our state still, but forever, that I think are destructive and harmful and evil. So I don't just not care about that. I advocate for different views, but I realize at the end of the day, I don't have the civil political leverage to actuate that. So let's talk a little bit about neo-Calvinism for the next couple minutes, because this is where I would not say that I would say this, that our denomination is, I'm not going to decide what the percentages are, but we're on the right side of that. So and there's probably some Christian nationalists in our denomination, it's probably pretty small. That word is horrifying and inflammatory, but you should at least read about what they really believe, so that you're at least informed. And, in terms of what they want, a lot of stuff if you're not a Christian nationalist, you'd be like, that would be wonderful. It's sort of a methodology and implications of what they want. But our denomination is by far and most two kingdoms in neo-Calvinism. If there's Christian nationalists in it, I would think it's a pretty small percentage, although, there's a lot of us. So let me talk about neo-Calvinism for a minute. It was born in the 19th century by Dutch guys like Kuyper and Bavinck and a bunch of other folks. And what they were saying was, hey, Calvin started Calvinism, so that's the Paleo-Calvinism, okay, the old Calvinism. And then what happened was Calvin's first successors scholastified that. They made it extremely technical. In particular, they're called the scholastics. Turretin is one of them, and there's others. And they refined it to granular specificity. And part of that was also our confession of faith, the Puritans and the Divines in the Westminster Confession. But what happened was these Dutch guys, who were living in a world that was saturated in Christianity, their culture started to experience the Enlightenment and the Industrial Revolution. And they started to say, wow, our culture is creating tension points and pain points and raising questions that Calvin could not have anticipated, and that the scholastics, which is what they were called, one of the names, they couldn't have anticipated either. So we need to, and this is back to your question, Timothy, these guys were hardcore confessional Calvinists in their theology. They weren't neo-Calvinists like neo-orthodoxy in the next century, which was sort of like, if you hold it in the right light and turn it just the right way and close one eye and really try, you can see that it's orthodoxy. That's not what these guys were. But they were saying it was a new application of historic Calvinism's view of Scripture, the human person, the covenants, predestination, all that stuff. And they were trying to apply it in a setting that was fundamentally different. Well, not fundamentally different because human condition doesn't change, but was substantially different. And they were saying, look, the paleo, the first what we would call sometimes the magisterial reformers, they laid a great foundation, but we've got to ask questions and answer questions that aren't being asked. So here's some strengths and weaknesses. One of the strengths is that it recognizes the distinction between church and state without absolutizing it. So it gives me a place to understand that I still get to be a citizen. This is the language of spheres that I talked about earlier. I can operate in different spheres. We'll talk about that a little bit. Recognizes the validity of various social, commercial, familial, and political spheres. What they articulated was that, look, according to the constitution of Scripture, we talked about it in Genesis chapter 9 at the very first class. I'm sure you all remember everything I said. But God established families, God established commerce, God established governments. Those are three spheres. Each one of those spheres has its own, if you will, charter constitution in the social and biblical order. Families have a certain function and a certain right. Governments have certain rights. Families, an individual family can't take the life of someone that took the life of one of theirs. That's something the state should exercise. And these are called spheres in this view. And by categorizing these different areas as spheres, we can see them as distinct. The family is distinct from the state. The state is distinct from the family. Commerce and private property are distinct from both, and they have different functions, although all of these things overlap. And one of the geniuses of Neo-Calvinism is it helps us to think biblically about all those spheres so that we can understand that, for example, the flashpoint in our age is the relationship of human sexuality to the family. Like, if schools will not tell parents about the gender choices that a 10-year-old makes, that raises a profound, what we would call, sphere question. Does the state have the right to circumvent the parent's oversight, instruction, and influence on the child? I think the answer is categorically no. It does not have that right. But functionally, in our world, it absolutely has that right. And it's a point of contention, and it's being exercised. That's a confusion of spheres. And back to your question, that is one that we should advocate for. We're not to simply say, well, that's a different sphere. We should be concerned about that. It also grounds and elucidates the doctrine of common grace. Is the world broken? Yes or no?
Yes.
Yes.
Good answer. Is the world as broken as it possibly could be?
No.
No.
That's another good answer. The reason the world isn't as broken as it could be, is what these guys developed, it was already recognized, the doctrine of common grace. That God, remember, he says, let's not do the harvest yet because we'll take up some of the wheat with the tares. That God exercises his restraining grace. And that means that the government can and does often do good things. Who wants to live in a city with no government? You cannot be a Christian and be anti-government as a principle or category. You can have questions about the government, but you can't be, and they exercise things rightly. Provides the church and the Christian with the theology of cultural and political engagement, which we'll talk about more. In other words, by looking at these spheres, I can say, well, I'm operating in my church sphere, and according to the biblical appointment of the church, it has certain authorities and rights that are inalienable, cannot be taken. The state cannot decide who can become a member of my church. And but then then I go to the political sphere, and I think to myself as a cleric, well, also the church can't dictate everything it might want to the state, because the church has not been given the sword. And once you're not given the sword, that means all the apparatus that lead up to the use of the sword are also, you might have a voice and an influence on those, but you don't get to pull all the levers on that. So this is really a significant way to operate, but it does give me a way to engage. And if it's done rightly, we realize that cultural triumphalism doesn't work. We have to work in a leavening fashion over time. As I said a couple weeks ago, recapturing Christian influence as it was 75 years ago, I would say two things about that. One, it was a terrible, immoral, evil mistake for us not to care about Jim Crow. It was the categorical, God's judgment is going to come on the church. Now, by the way, we did a lot more than you know. You should read about it. By the way, we a lot more of our people were crying out about that, but not enough. So we have to understand that if moving away from triumphalism, if we want to get back to a more well-grounded view of the family and all the things that are important to us, we have to also include economic justice and as well as social and sexual justice and shalom. And guess what? It's going to take 150 years if we go really fast. It just is, because that's the way that societies works. It gave the church a full voice, including special revelation and natural law. What I mean by that is, here's what, speaking in blocky terms, two kingdoms would say the church operates by special revelation. The government just has natural law, which is the law of God in our heart. And that we're really speaking special revelation, like for example, in a committee meeting if you're a legislator, would be probably ineffective. It still might be ineffective, but it might also be inappropriate. That's not how they operate. Neo-Calvinism lets me understand that although there's two different spheres, the church's witness to be a light in the world is also allows me to speak about a more robust and more complete social vision and even the person of Christ. And then it reflects the ministry of Jesus and the New Testament church comprehensively. The church should be concerned, and if we're going to advocate for private property, which I think is a fundamental biblical human right, we should also advocate for a more just opportunity to gather and own private property, as well as sexual ethics. If we're going to talk about the love of God, we should help people who are hungry or are not healthy and can't get health care. It's a more comprehensive vision. All right, let me do the three weaknesses. Actually, there's more than three. One of the things that concerns people have about Neo-Calvinism, and if we're not careful, it's right, is that it distracts the salvific or salvation focus of Christ's work and the church's mission. It's considered to be a door for the social gospel, which is the turning the work of Christianity and the work of Jesus from both a vertical and horizontal application and implications to just horizontal implications. So that's, I think that's something that we should think about. It also tends to obscure, or can, the beatific vision. For example, the end goal of Christianity is to know God and to see Him. And it can obscure that with the overemphasis on renewing creation and making the world the way it should be. I don't think it inherently needs to do any of these, but it sure can, and we need to be aware of it. And engagement can become accommodation, which of course, we know for a fact. The slippery slope. Everybody's like, is there really a slippery slope? And I don't like that because people don't like it, and it usually doesn't work. So my answer is, well, you can decide if there's a slippery slope or not, but we do know for a fact there is a narrow way. Because Jesus told us there's a narrow way, and we just need to stay on it. So what we're going to do next week, and this is the teaser, we're going to apply principles of any one of these you want, but we're going to focus on Neo-Calvinism to the two big political issues through human history and certainly in our era. We're going to apply it to sex and money. So come next week to learn what I mean by that. All right, thanks.